The Greek word demokratia combines demos, a term for the people, with kratos, a term for power. It emphasizes the direct participation of ordinary people in self-government. Athenian citizens didn't just vote, they regularly attended a public assembly, spoke on public matters, and directly participated in the making of public laws. This kind of assembly democracy was very different from modern representative government because it relied on a more active notion of what it meant to be a citizen. The etymology of democracy also reveals something distinctive. Unlike other terms of government such as monarchy and oligarchy, the suffix of democracy is not based on the Greek word for rule, which is arche, but the Greek word for power, kratos. Athenians were about power to the people. The original term didn't refer to the rule of the mob, but the power or capacity of people to accomplish things of value in the public realm. I'm James Muldoon, I'm a lecturer in political science at the University of Exeter, and this video offers an overview of the theory and institutions of Athenian democracy. This video has been made in collaboration with James Kerstead from Victoria University, Wellington. We often hear that democracy was born in ancient Athens, but there's some evidence that suggests otherwise. First, there were popular assemblies in ancient civilizations of Mesopotamia. Second, Athens was not the first or only democracy in the Greek world. But Athens remains an important historical moment in democracy's development. The most detailed early records we have of the emergence of democratic forms of government are from city-states around the Mediterranean and Black Seas. There are at least 20 to 40 democratic city-states which had some form of popular council. But the one we know the most about is Athens, which was in many ways an exceptional city because it was larger, more prosperous, and more influential than the average Greek polis. Although we often hear that the Greeks invented democracy, we actually have very little surviving evidence of democratic theory from the ancient world. Athens was more or less a democracy for almost 200 years, but we only have scattered fragments about what they thought about it. Most of what we know comes from anti-democratic writers like Plato and Aristotle. Perhaps because the Athenians took the nature of their government for granted, they didn't feel the need to justify its existence. Anti-democratic writers, on the other hand, had to make the case for building an alternative. It's worth noting that many of the foundational texts in Western politics are written by aristocratic rather than democratic authors. In both the ancient and early modern worlds, democracy was generally understood in pejorative terms. Democratic institutions emerged gradually in Athens over the course of the 6th and 5th centuries BC. The exact date of their emergence depends on what you consider to be the most important about the institutions of democracy. There are 3 main dates we could consider. First, the reforms of the lawgiver Solon in 594 BC. These laws eliminated the enslavement of Athenian citizens, put limitations on magistrates' powers, and reduced the power of the aristocracy. The next major stage in the development of democratic institutions occurred in 508 BC. This change resulted from a conflict between 2 aristocratic families, which led to one of them assisting in a Spartan invasion of Athens. An uprising against the Spartans and their Athenian supporters allowed Cleisthenes to radically reform the social and political structure of the city. The reform split up the traditional 4 tribes of Athens into 10 new artificial tribes. A third date in this development is 462 BC, when the Areopagus Council, which was a smaller council of former magistrates, was stripped of most of its powers. By this stage in the mid-5th century, all of the institutions we now associate with democratic Athens were in place. Athens had also developed into an imperial power that exercised great influence across the Aegean Peninsula. Democratic values and identity. Democratic values emerged in the Greek world as part of a broader culture that celebrated moderation, discipline, and patriotism. This culture gradually won out over rival aristocratic ideas that emphasized luxury and rule by elites. The Athenians contrasted their communal life of equal citizens with the Persian rule by a single person. Democracy was based on an idea of active citizenship in which a large portion of the native male population enjoyed equal standing in public life. It was based on a rejection of the rule by a small elite, but it was also based on the exclusion of women, slaves, and foreigners from full citizenship. The values of freedom and equality were essential, but these were expressed in their own vocabulary. I'll cover 6 of their main political values. The first is isonomia, the idea that Athenian citizens were equal before the law. This term is often used as a way of expressing the idea of democracy in the early 5th century. Herodotus presents the idea when arguing for a democratic government in Persia. A second example would be the Athenian drinking song in honor of tyrant slayers who were celebrated for having brought isonomia to Athens. A second ideal was isogoria, an equality of speech. All citizens were entitled to address the main deliberative assembly. The assembly opened with a herald who proclaimed, "Who wishes to speak?" Of course, it was usually the rich and powerful who ended up speaking most, but there is evidence that some less well off were able to speak as well. Herodotus, in Book 4 of the Histories, claimed that the Athenians grew in power after Cleisthenes' reforms, and this proved that equality of speech was a good thing. A third value was parrhesia, which meant to speak freely without fear or intimidation. It represented the idea that people should be able to speak freely in the interests of the common good. It seemed to be particularly valued when an individual spoke out despite some kind of personal risk. One example is from one of Euripides' plays, where a common messenger goes up to the king of Thebes and asks, "Can I speak to you with parrhesia?" A fourth value was eleutheria, which meant freedom. In Pericles' famous funeral oration, he praised Athenian democracy by stating they enjoyed eleutheria in their politics and tolerance in their private lives. In Book 8 of the Republic, Plato also described the democratic polis as packed with parrhesia and eleutheria. A fifth value was deliberation. The central institution of democratic Athens was a large deliberative assembly in which speeches were heard on matters of public concern. These democratic institutions emphasized the importance of speech as a political tool and enhanced the power of persuasion and the force of the better argument. Demosthenes argued that it was desirable to hear from a broad range of people so that the polis could have the best chance of finding the solution to the problem it faced. Sixth, accountability. All the city officials had to go through a compulsory audit at the end of their terms in office. This was known as the euthanaia procedure, and it was to make sure they hadn't embezzled public funds or committed any corruption. The idea that public officials were ultimately accountable to the people was an important idea for Athenian citizens. Officials had to provide evidence of what they did during their terms of office. Democratic institutions. We know a lot about the Athenian democratic system from a text by Aristotle or one of his students called the Constitution of Athens. Not all people living in Athens were entitled to citizenship. Only native, freeborn men over the age of 18 could be citizens, which excluded women, slaves, and foreigners. Every citizen had a right to sit on the ecclesia, which was the main assembly open to all citizens. Athenians had a form of direct democracy, where the main forum for deliberation and lawmaking was open to all citizens. There were an estimated 30,000 to 60,000 citizens in the polis, and the assembly had a quorum of 6,000. The assembly discussed everything from financial matters to religious ones, and from festivals to relations with foreign powers. It was the highest and most definitive institution in the Athenian democratic system. For most of the 4th century BC, citizens were paid for attending the assembly, so even the relatively poor could afford to participate. In addition to the main assembly, there were around 700 positions as government officials that were for the most part appointed randomly. This included the Council of 500, which would prepare laws to be discussed by the assembly. The council represented the full-time government of Athens, and its 500 members consisted of 50 from each of the 10 tribes. It could issue decrees on certain matters, but most important issues would be further discussed and decided upon in the assembly. Everyone serving on the council first had to undergo scrutiny to make sure they were fit for service. There were a smaller number of officials who were elected, but this seemed to Athenians to be a far less democratic method because it opened the doors to one's personal charisma, wealth, and family connections to help one achieve office. But there were a few roles where Athenians thought that experience and expertise were essential. These included the board of 10 generals who were selected from elite military families. But the generals were ultimately governed by the assembly, and even successful generals could be quickly dumped. The administration of law in democratic Athens was primarily in the hands of the people's courts. Large juries of 200 or more jurors listened to oral arguments made by litigants in both civil and criminal cases. The Athenian political system was quite successful, as Athens managed to outperform its rivals on various measures of overall state flourishing. We could argue that it had its democratic values and institutions to thank. Democracy and the theatre. The political institutions of democratic Athens were intimately connected to their cultural institutions, particularly that of tragic drama. Athenian democracy tolerated a substantial level of political criticism. The drama presented in the theatre of Dionysus were chosen by a magistrate and financed by a special tax on wealthy citizens. Both comedies and tragedies were typically critical of political institutions and their leaders. There is evidence to show that a critical community of writers, philosophers, and rhetoricians engaged in a collective interrogation of democratic values through the theatre. The configuration of the theatre encouraged a sense that all life's events were public and open to the interpretation of all. There is thus a close connection between the city's political institutions and the theatre. Citizens could bring wisdom they gained from watching tragedies to their role as democratic citizens. The experience of a shared viewing as equals also maintained a cultural equality and a sense of legitimacy to the democratic institutions. At the same time as Greek theatre criticised these institutions, it also reinforced their legitimacy as being the centre of political life and open to debate. Aside from 2 brief periods of oligarchy, Athenian democracy lasted for the best part of 2 centuries. Cleisthenes' democratic form of government persisted in Athens until the Athenian defeat by a Macedonian general in 322 BC. The practices and institutions of Athenian democracy continue to play an important role in the development of political theory, with writers as diverse as James Madison, John Stuart Mill, and Hegel all constructing their own political ideas with Athenian democracy as an important reference point. While for most modern writers, Athens was seen as a cautionary tale of what an excess of democracy might lead to, for writers such as Hannah Arendt and Cornelius Castoriadis, Athenian democracy still held important lessons about the nature of political freedom and how it could be actualized in the modern world.